So, many of you have heard my name or seen me in the context of plain language before. I work for GSA in their Office of Strategic Communications, and I run GSA's plain language program. The last couple of years, we've had a summit. You should be seeing some more information coming up about that in a couple of weeks when we get that finalized. I am going to stop my personal video because really it's just going to be me, but maybe waving my arms. Maybe you can imagine that. And if I do that, we will have a little less of a load. And besides, the most important thing about this is the PowerPoint deck anyway. So this is Plain Language Basics through Digitalgov University. I'm very grateful for their help as always. And I'm Katherine Spivey. So, okay, what have I done that I'm not moving to the next slide? There we go. I didn't press firmly enough. Always a thing. So what are you going to do in this class? You're going to learn how to recognize plain language and write it yourself and why you need to. How the Plain Writing Act of 2010 affects government agencies, federal government agencies, and what and how you write, and more about the federal plain language community. Now, you'll probably learn some other things, but these are the ones that I'm aiming for. Let me go back for just a minute for the course objectives. I should have said, if you have any questions, put them in the chat. Rhett will let me know if there's something I need to address. This is like the equivalent of seeing someone's hand raised. But please put that in the chat, and we'll have some discussion time at maybe between the sections or at the end, just so you know. So what is the definition of plain language? And I should say here first that you might hear a couple of different terms, as you're learning more about plain language. There's plain language, there's plain writing, there's plain English, plain Spanish, plain French, for all that. And these terms are all more or less the same. I do have to tell you that I am only qualified to talk about plain English, but I usually call it plain language. I mean, there are other countries doing a lot of work in plain language, and they customize it for the language that their country speaks. But I can only talk about plain English. The industry standard, and this is according to a couple of international organizations, the industry standard appears to be clear communications, and partially that's because they were trying to include visual communications. So that's just a little piece of information I thought you'd find useful. Whether it's plain English, plain writing, plain language, clear communications, that all means more or less the same. But what is it? What is plain language? Well, something's in plain language if your audience can do three things, and all of these three need to apply. People have to be able to find what they need. If they can't find it, if it's not obvious, if it's not easy to get to, it's not in plain language. They have to be able to understand what they find the first time they read or hear it. And the important word there is first. None of this, I had to read it 7 times to figure out what I was supposed to do. First time. And then use what they read or hear to meet their needs. In other words, do not give me information I cannot use. That's one of the reasons you may have, for example, heard that it's important to have a clear subject line in an email. Does this apply to me or does it not? That's, an important question, because if I don't see an immediate application to my work or my life, I delete it. I'm not going to read it and try and figure out, do I need to know this? So the 3 legs, so to speak, of the plain language stool are finding, understanding, and using. And those 3 things have to work. Okay, how do we do that? Well, there are some guidelines. And these are the federal plain language guidelines that are listed in the Plain Writing Act. There'll be more on that later. And much of this information is taken from the information on plainlanguage.gov, which many of you probably have seen at some point or another. It is where we keep the plain language guidelines and, excuse me, a ton of before and after examples and information about the law and resources and training material and, you know, all of that. So you can easily get a lot of plain language information there. But the techniques are on the part of the guidelines, and these are the techniques, and I put them in the most important to the least important order. Some people do easiest to hardest. So, you know, the most important is reader-centered organization, and we'll have some more information about that. What that means is, can your reader find it? You know, is it what your reader wants to know in a language that your reader understands? You know, you can't just put it out there. Yeah. One of the things that I saw once when I was working with an organization to get their meetings up on a website was they started their announcement, their information. We are so proud, or more precisely, the Office of X is extremely proud to bring you this industry day. And I said, that's very much about the office. And they said, well, we are proud. And I said, well, you know, that's good. There's nothing wrong with being proud of your work. But why does that matter to the people you're inviting? You know, so we changed it to meet industry people in person and discuss your contract or your project or whatever. So that is just a small sample of focusing or centering information on your reader. But you know, you might also have heard this as writing for your reader. What does your reader want to know? What language does your reader use? So that is what I always consider the most important, because you could do all the other things, but if you are not doing reader-centered organization, it is going to fail. It's just going to, you know, miss the mark entirely. And who has enough time to be rewriting all the time? Not me. The second technique is design features, and those are things that you have used. Tables, headers, bulleted lists, or numbered lists. These are things that you have used already. And in fact, many of the techniques, if you have taken any class, any writing class whatsoever, you have probably at some point learned more about plain language, even if it wasn't called plain language. Could have been called news writing or effective writing or, you know, journalism or, you know, anything like business writing, but anything with these techniques. Shorter sentences and paragraphs. One of the things you'll see is, you know, pages that you think, why did anyone let that go? You know, that's just cruel to have to watch, really. Another technique is using pronouns. That helps a lot. One of the things with the federal government, and Plain is generally geared toward the federal government, is people do not feel part of it. They don't feel, you know, that they're being spoken to. And part of that is our fault because we use a lot of jargon and acronyms and long sentences, and it's hard to wade through. And we need to break that down. And one of those ways, as I'll be explaining more about later, is pronouns. And another way to reach your audience better is to focus on verbs, not nouns, and to write an active voice. You know, I promise this is not going to be a huge grammar fest. There are a few grammatical points that make plain language easier, and we will be going over those. But, you know, part of it, as I said before, it's focusing on your reader and what your reader wants to know. And the final point for plain language is less jargon and fewer acronyms. You know, that's one of the things that people say is characteristic of bureaucratic writing, and that tends to not get read. or people misunderstand it, which is just tedious because generally we are writing to get people to do something. And if it's hard for them to understand, they will not do it, or they will call with questions, or they will write, or they'll email in with questions. And I don't know about you, I'm not sure I have time for any more emails that I already get, or phone calls either. So this is a quick question. Or Rhett, were you going to do the first poll? Maybe not. Maybe this is a question for the chat. What is your favorite technique that you're using already? You can just put your answer in the chat. I may not be looking at the chat in real time, but we are going to look at it. I'll be looking at it afterwards, so I just wanted to let you know that it would be. What do you think is the easiest technique of the ones listed on this page? Ah,
Catherine, I think this is the poll that you wanted to launch.
right, yes. What have you heard before? This is excellent. Very interesting. I'm getting a little seasick, but you know, it's an interested seasick.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
half the people responding. I'm going to close the poll in about 2 seconds.
Yeah. Short sentences and paragraphs win. Yay. Very interesting. Yeah, and I think that my question was also, what's your favorite or what's the easiest? And you can put that in the chat. That is not the same as the question of the polling techniques, which is what have you heard of before? Do I just X this out, Rhett?
It is the poll has been removed.
Okay, well, I'm still seeing it, so I'll just remove it. So, okay, thank you very much. That was my first interactive poll, so you know we're all celebrating together. Let's see. Okay, I am just double checking that I didn't miss anything. Another thing is the law, the Plain Writing Act of 2010. So this year on October 13th is the 10th anniversary. I think it's what, paper or China, something like that. But we're all going to be celebrating. There's also some executive orders that apply to language as well as with for regulations, because one of the things is the Plain Writing Act does not apply to regulations, and it only applies to the federal government. This doesn't prevent you from doing plain language as a best practice or in the name of customer service, but you know, this is the Plain Writing Act only applies to the feds. So for the Plain Writing Act of 2010, the things that we have to pay attention to right now: all new government documents that meet the following criteria must be written in plain language. And that is documents that are necessary to get government benefits or services or for filing taxes. Documents that provide information about federal benefits or services. And documents that explain to the public how to comply with a federal requirement. Now, this legislation applies to both paper and electronic, whether it's letters, publications, forms, notices, instructions, anything. What it doesn't apply to, as I've mentioned, is regulations, although there are some executive orders that apply to that. And it does not apply to internal websites or internal emails. which is kind of sad because that would have been very useful. So this, at any rate, if people say, oh, I don't want to do plain language, and their material falls under one of these three, it doesn't make any difference whether they want to or not. They have to. Because, and this is the important thing, this is part of the reader-centered organization, there's a person who's receiving these materials, and we really need to make it easier for that person to understand and do what we want them to. I don't know about you, but a couple years ago, it was in the summer, and I got a notice about the transit subsidy on Monday. That's something that we're able to do. And I got a email on Monday, and then I got an email on Tuesday that explained the Monday one, and then I got one on Wednesday that explained Tuesday's explanation, and on Thursday I gave up. And I had just had it. I've been reading, and it's not any clearer. They keep making less clear, and then they are wasting my time explaining something over and over again. So I gave up. I went to the person in my office who knew about these things, and I said, do I need to know anything about this email? And she said, no, you live in Virginia. Apparently the transit subsidy thing only applied to Maryland. I don't know. I mean, you would have thought that either they could have chosen the audience, only people who live in Maryland, or, said somewhere up near the front, this only applies if you live in Maryland, because I could have deleted it with a cool conscience and muted, subsequent, the following material. So this is the Plain Writing Act. If you want, you can read the law itself and the final guidance. That material is on plainlanguage.gov under law and I think it's just law. So let's think for a moment what plain language is not. And this comes up a great deal. Some people seem to think that, plain language is writing less precisely. And it's not. I've had some interesting debates lately about whether more means the same as an additional. And I have to say that no one has been able to give me a definition, an instance where additional meant anything more than more, as it were. Plain language is not dumbing down. It's not a help to have a government send out material that their people cannot understand, the people affected by the law. It's not a big grammar fest. I'm so sorry for those of you who thought it was going to be, 3 hours of talking about grammar, but that's not this class. One of the things I do is, there's some grammatical elements, that do make things easier. It's also not a big style guide thing, except that your style guide should include, appropriate material should be in plain language. I'm not going to come arm wrestle anyone over serial commas. My preference is for them, but my division follows AP style with certain exceptions. So, that is pretty interesting. Plain language is also not writing to a certain grade level. Writing to a certain grade level can be an interesting tool, but it's not the only thing. I mean, we have a lot of variability in reading levels, and our agencies and even divisions and offices within agencies have different audiences, so it's something to consider. It's also not adding folksy terms or leaving out necessary technical terms. All of these things do emphasize that plain language is about knowing your audience and writing for them, not writing for yourself. So, all of these things that plain language is not. What surprises you about what plain language is not? If you could answer that in the chat. I'm interested in knowing, what you think, what surprises you about what plain language is not. So if you can just take a minute while you do that.
Catherine, we also have a couple of polls here. Do you want us to launch them?
Okay, sure. I'm sorry. I was, starting to talk. Yeah.
So the question in the poll is, what have you heard the most out of
Got
reading?
it. Right.
Writing less precisely, dumbing it down, grammar,
Mm-hmm.
style guide,
Ah, interesting.
folksy, or leaving out necessary technical terms. If you can't,
Thank you, Rhett, for remembering this.
yeah, no problem. Feel free to put it in the chat if you can't see the poll.
That is very interesting.
All right, we're getting close to about half people in, so
Mm-hmm.
I'll end the poll and show you guys the results.
Okay. Good to know. I mean, what that means is maybe I need to address that in future classes. What about the other poll about what surprises you? Do you have that one? Or is that something they have to answer in the chat?
That's going to be something that they're going to have to answer in the chat.
Okay, right, because it's multiple choice. Okay, just, what surprises you about what plain language is not? Okay, I'm going to go on. I say that with some firmness, maybe I'm not. Okay. So one of the parts about, as I said, reader-centered organization is identifying your audience so you can write for them. And you have to ask yourself these questions. Who am I writing for? What is my purpose? Why do I want them to read this? What do they need? And what might they already know? And another question, which I didn't think of adding, is what is their purpose? I have received some communication sometimes that makes me think, why did I get this? What assumptions, I mean, whatever assumptions they're making about me and what the information I need are wrong. They're not sending me information. I mean, they'd send me stuff about, I'd get stuff about like accounting, and I do a lot of things, but accounting is not one of them. So I'm not going to read that. So these are some key questions every time you sit down to start writing. What does your audience, who is your audience, and what do they need to know? And writing for your reader, not yourself. This is very important because it is so easy. We get mastery over a topic, or we know something about a topic and we want to talk and, explain it and let people know. But what we ask is not, what do I want to say or tell them? I mean, that's what we wrongly start with, but what do they need to know? And often what they need to know is something very little. Sometimes I get some emails from our help desk, the IT help desk, where they say things like, it's important to do security, da 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 da, and then at the bottom is what they want me to do, which is to, I don't know, update or remove or something like that. And they could just put that at the top and I would do it. I don't need the explanation. Sometimes emails are purely transactional and I don't need to understand it. Click here to refresh your GSIMs, whatever, I'll do that. So what do they need to know, and in what amount of detail do they need to know? Writing for your reader, not yourself. Instead of asking, how can I protect my interests? Then that could be as big as, how can I show that I really know my topic and that I've considered the alternatives? Ask, how can I serve my audience's interests or needs? And that means you have to find out what they want and what they need to know and what they need to do and how you support that. Similarly, instead of what can I do to impress my audience, which I've seen with vocabulary choices, ask what can I do to help my audience? You know, many of us have larger larger vocabularies we understand more than we use, because that's a pain. You know, if every time you have to sit down and you have to, sort of mentally translate what somebody says. Yeah, who wants to do that? Who has time? That's a barrier. That's a very real barrier. So here are 3 write for your reader, not yourself, things to consider as you're doing that. You have seen this, I'm sure, in any of your classes, and that is the inverted pyramid you organize for your reader. Most important information at the top, facts and figures, that's supporting information, and then the nice to have but not vital. You know, put the action first. What do they need to do? So here is our first text that we're going to review. What I'm going to do is, let me see if I can actually do it. Hurrah, yay. I will put this in the chat in case you're like me and you prefer to see, let's see, and you prefer to see the shapes of the words. So here is, let's say I want to type this to everyone. I'm just going to call this Coast Guard example. And as I said, okay, there we go. So I've just shared that. So if you want to rewrite it, you can do that. It's always, okay, I think that's right. Okay, I didn't realize I would miss everything. Shut your eyes if you get seasick. Okay, so what we have is a Coast Guard example, which I have put in the chat, but it starts out, the Coast Guard has conducted an investigation to determine what carbon monoxide CO detection devices are available to recreational boaters such that, when installed and activated, could reduce the risk of being exposed to high levels of CO, that silent killer. A variety of technologies is available for detecting the presence of CO on boats and should be considered by recreational boaters to reduce their risk of injury or death while boating. So one of the questions I have about this is, what's wrong with it? You can put some notes in the chat. Yes, what would you do in this example? Thank you for remembering that better than I did, Rhett. Short sentences and paragraphs, yes, definitely that's going on, because there's only 2 sentences in that paragraph, which is, last time I checked, 72 words.
So it looks like we're slowing down on voting.
Yeah, yeah, go ahead. Okay, very interesting. Yeah, reader-centered, I'm sorry, short sentences and paragraphs, reader-centered. So the way we would fix this is, what would we put in? Obviously, the things that we've decided from the poll. So this is just a graphic that could go with it, but one of the rewrites, remember, the original paragraph, carbon monoxide is a silent killer. The Coast Guard recommends that you use a carbon monoxide detection device on your boat to reduce the risk of being exposed to high levels of this deadly gas. You may choose from a variety of devices. Well, that's better. But one of the things you'll learn the more you do plain language is that you can almost always make something better. Just sometimes the due date comes up or the due time comes up before you've reached that point. So there's this rewrite. Carbon monoxide is a silent killer. I was pretty sure that they wanted silent killer kept in there. Use a detection device on your boat. It will reduce your risk of being exposed to high levels of this deadly gas and being injured or killed. I see that I need to add that. Choose from many devices. And for those of you who thought a list would come in handy, that's where I'd put it. So it could still be improved. You know, I'm looking at some things right now and thinking, yeah, it could be done. But compare it to, and I'm going to go back to the original post on this one, 4 lines and a teaser sentence for the list versus that. So it takes rewriting. You know, there's a lot of rewriting that goes on in plain language, you know, as you find out things. Okay, so our next part is looking at how do you use design to get your reader through information. And one way is to use headers. It allows people to scan and find information. It breaks up information and it increases blank space on the page and allows your page and your reader to breathe. I mean, I have some examples later on that literally, you're like, oh, I don't want to read this. I don't want to read this. I mean, it's just that imposing, and it doesn't have to be. So one of the things is there are different types of headers. You can use topics, you can make statements, or you can use questions. And questions have, you know, a certain value. If readers have similar questions in mind, if the questions help readers relate, like do I have to, or things like that, and if the questions help you organize the information, I think it's useful trying a couple of different ways to see, you know, what people use and testing those, of course. For example, this is an example of a question heading. How do I know if I'm eligible to extend my stay in the US? And there's a couple of possibilities. You know, you may apply for an extension of stay if bullet, 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 bullet. So that would help you. Another sample is, excuse me, let me just double check. Okay, this is the original sample. You know, please furnish medical evidence. And then with headers, it looks like, I mean, here's the sample, 2 pages of samples. And then the headers rewrite. We have your claim, what we need, when we need it, and your right to privacy. So you could look at just the headers and find out what part, you know, what the headers should indicate the information underneath relates to this topic. So obviously all the information under here is about privacy. All the information about here is what do you have to turn in, what we need, when we need it. We need it by date. And if you don't turn it in by that date, we'll have to turn you down or turn your claim down. And similarly, you could use question headers. Instead of what we need, what do we need from you? When do we need it? Question mark. And what are your privacy rights? Here are your privacy rights. So, you know, there might be a point where questions are more appropriate than just the statements. It depends. We also have a section on choosing words. And this is where we see a lot of possibility for improvement. I think that's the most tactful way to put it. Choose shorter words when you can. Avoid jargon unless you're going to explain it. Reduce your use of acronyms, and I'm adding this for accuracy's sake, initialisms. Use personal pronouns and contractions. Use active voice and avoid hidden verbs. So these are all, the sorts of things that we see. So from that, one of the choose shorter words, this is, a pretty straightforward list of some of the things that I see a lot, and these are things that I change. The biggest one on my list is utilize, because to my mind, what I learned was that utilize is a very specific meaning. It's not just a fancier, more impressive version of use. It's using something for which it's not originally designed. So it's a little pedantic of me, but people fall into habits where they just say, oh, let's use this word. Like, we anticipate that we will be attempting to commence, to demonstrate or implement our utilization of, and it just gets tiresome. People do not talk like that unless they're on Masterpiece Theater and centuries old. So, why should we have that when we want people to do? Now, of these words, and they don't have to be just these words, what's a similar word that you don't like, that you see all the time, that's not on this list? Can you just put that in the chat? I'll tell you one from me. I'm seeing leverage, and I am tired of it. I generally just say use or influence instead, because, as I've remarked a little caustically before, there's no actual lever involved. So, at any rate, this is how not to be. um, these are words that do not necessarily make that much of a difference. And you might as well use common words that people do not have to stop and look up to double check that they're understanding it properly. And similarly, avoid jargon. And some of these words, excuse me for going back, some of these words are falling into jargon because they come into, people just use them by rote, and they're not thinking about what they're writing and how they can make it more direct or more plain. So jargon is, insider lingo. That's the whole point. Those in the know get it, and if you don't get it, you're not in the know. So it's an exclusive, it excludes, and we're trying not to do that. It's often pretentious. It's often marked by acronyms, as the FAS, ITC, OSP. If I don't know what that means, then your communication makes no sense. Make your point without it, and that's one of the things that you can do with pronouns, as I'll be talking about a little bit later. So jargon, that's one of the things that people dislike the most. Remember, Plain Writing Act applies to things that go to the public, things that explain to the public. So you have to make sure they don't have to have insider knowledge for it to make sense. That's the important point. You can still send those terrible emails if you must, but not covered by the Plain Writing Act. Okay, reduce your use of acronyms. If you're wondering what this horrible slide is, oh, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. Bad me. Is there any particular jargon that you hate? I am very unhappy with certain times, in these uncertain times. I'm just tired of reading that. So that's my piece of hated jargon. So just add your note to the chat with other jargon that you dislike. Reduce acronyms. This is one agency's, I'm not going to name it, this is one agency's list of accepted acronyms. You know, and that's just a little tedious. You know, if you can not use that, what they do is exclude. I used to be, I mean, it's just like jargon. I used to work on First Fridays, and what First Fridays did was test any government website on the first Friday of the month. And so, you know, it was always very exciting to see, you know, what we were going to get. And sometimes it was travel, like the passport page, or it was something from Veterans Affairs, or, you know, NIH or whatever, any federal agency. And we ended up finding out that with this testing, it revealed some top 10 information that was of particular relevance to me, that I was particularly interested in. And part of that was there's just too much content. There's just too many words, too many pages, too much. And that was often in the top 3 or the top 5. And the other thing was there's too much jargon and there's too many acronyms. You know, that people just don't know what they mean, and they find that really tiring. So, you know, we were looking at that and trying to figure out how can we, you know, how do we work against that? And one of those things is plain language will help us reduce acronyms, reduce jargon, and reduce content, you know, if you're writing more straightforwardly. So with the acronyms, and acronyms and initialisms, let me see if I got that. Acronyms are when you use the first letter of each word to form something pronounceable, like NASA. And initialisms are when you use the letter of the words, but you say all the letters separately, like GSA. So, you know, for what that's worth, there is something for different. Don't use them for infrequent pages. One of the things about the digital, you know, everything going digital, is we have a much better idea of how people read on the page. I don't know if you've ever, I mean, you'll see something later on, the heat mapping, you know, where do people's eyes go on pages? How do they find information? That's one of the great things that usability testing allows us to check. How are people coming to the page? What are they doing? And they may not read sequentially. They may hit Control F and just search for something. They may not follow your navigation. So don't use it if it's infrequent. You know, go ahead and spell it out. Don't invent new ones. I used to work in another branch of GSA, and I was working with the telecommunications group, and they said, okay, we have some new pages for the website. We'd like you to add them. Can you look at them first? And I was looking at them, and they had invented, well, they had dispatch handling services, DHS. And I went back to them and I said, you know, this looks fine, but DHS, I think Homeland Security has that locked down. You know, I think they get to use that. And they looked at me and they said, you know, we've been working on this for 6 months and we never noticed that. You know, I get that. People get involved in their topics, they get interested, they get very, very close to their content. One of the things that, as a plain language reviewer, one of the things that you bring is not being that familiar with their content. So you can say, I have a question about this. This doesn't make sense because, you know, it's absolutely true that dispatch handling services, the acronym for that would be DHS. They changed it to network dispatch handling services, which solved it. You know, so, you know, generally there are ways out of it. Don't let one acronym mean more than one thing is also part of that story as well. Okay, some of the alternatives You can just rename the council, the agency, the program. You can use we for your agency, and that'll solve some problems. Some people like to make acronyms pronounceable. I don't know. If you haven't used it for a while, redefine it. And that's sort of echoing what I said. If you haven't used it for a while, don't anticipate people are going to remember it. One of the pieces about grammar that I find that I sometimes have to talk about is pronouns. I mean, some of the grammar stuff. And incidentally, I'll add this in the follow-up, but one of the things that happens if people say, can you re-explain parallelism or whatever, I'm always like, sure. And then I send them an article for the online writing lab from Purdue University, which has great breakdowns of all kinds of grammar questions, and I use that one a lot. I'll send that with the rest of the information after the class. So what do pronouns do? And you've used them even if you don't remember right offhand what they're called. Pronouns replace nouns in sentences. So they speak directly to readers and they establish a relationship. They make your writing more relevant. If you're describing yourself as we, it makes sense to address your reader as you, not the applicant or the person signing the contract or whatever. Pronouns will also help you eliminate extra words. Sometimes you can also use contractions with those, and I go over that later. And you don't have to keep repeating the same words over and over. The office, the division, the agency, you can say we. And that's a lot easier than repeating the full name or relying on the acronym. I mean, it's perfectly correct to do that. How and when to use pronouns, this is tricky. Well, I mean, it's not. It's use we to refer to your agency or your division or your program. Now, I will say that a lot of my writing has been done on websites. And so whatever the we is, it's, whatever, that group of pages belong to, whether it's the agency as a whole or a subgroup or something else. But you can almost always say we. Use you for the reader, which allows you to use command voice or the imperative, which when you give orders like stop or send or fill out, that's really helpful. People want to know what to do. They don't want to be wondering, am I supposed to do this? Does somebody else do that? And as we talked about in the header section, you can use I and you or we and you in the question and answer formats. So that's another way of doing that. So contractions, just to remind you, they combine nouns and verbs, usually with an apostrophe. So we are becomes we're, like we're going to, be submitting these plans to the architect or whatever. Or we'll finish up our process in the next few months. I'll answer your email when I get back from vacation. And she'd planned to finish this, but COVID interrupted. You can use these. These are perfectly appropriate for English. This is where I learned, much to my surprise, that you can't change that to a different language. I actually learned that in high school. I was trying to convince my French teacher that you could say Suzanne's bicyclette, and she said, no, they don't use the apostrophe for ownership, which was a big shock, because that's how you learn grammar best, I think, from learning another language. Let me see where we are. Okay, what I'd like to do is take a quick 9-minute break and come back. We're just going to keep running this, but if you need more tea as I do or something, or yeah, I'll see you back at 2 o'clock.
And Catherine, while you're out, I can run a couple of polls that we.
Oh, that would be great. Sorry, this is the first time we've done polls, and I keep forgetting about them. So please run those. Thank you so much, Rhett.
Oh, So, like Catherine, you're welcome to step away for just a little bit and come right back at the top of the hour at 2 o'clock Eastern time. Um, I'm going to drop in a quick poll. One of the ones that we're talking about. Just want to see if anyone actually launched the poll here. Do you know about the the Plain Writing Act of 2010 law? Just kind of see what people's knowledge is. And as before, if you don't get a chance, just feel free to drop, or if you don't see the poll, feel free to drop your response in the chat. Some people may not see it. That's okay. All right, looks like we got it to about 45%. I'm going to end the poll in about 10 seconds, and I think we got a pretty good response. All right, I'm just ending the poll now, and so sharing the results, looks like about 58% of you, maybe a little higher, actually know or familiar with the Plain Writing Act of 2010. So apologies if you can't see the poll. Sometimes people on the web app may not be seeing our polls, but that's why we use the chat, and I appreciate it. And then I have one other poll here. The next one can both be kind of a discussion that we can have in the chat, as well as just kind of a quick question. Does the law actually affect your writing in your job? So how does it affect you? And maybe in the chat, if you want to kind of put some examples of how it affects your job, that'd be great. And this is just a simple yes, no, otherwise.
So I'm back. Does anyone have any questions that would help so much if I were to answer them now?
Sure, Catherine. Let me. I think we have about almost through this last poll, and then I can
Okay,
give you a couple of those questions as well.
great, thank you.
All right, we have about 37% in this poll. I'm going to end the poll now.
Possibly people ran to the kitchen or down the hall, so.
Oh, it's okay. So about 64% of you know about the law affecting your writing in your job. So that's pretty high. Pretty. And then Catherine, I'll forward you over some
Okay.
as well.
I was kind of assuming you would just shout them out. Or should I be checking my chat?
No, I can start it.
Okay.
So the first question we have here is, with pronouns, I've been told not use we, but say the agency instead. Is this incorrect?
I think what you have is two versions of correct. Both are grammatically correct. One is easier and plainer than the other, because the only alternative I can see instead of the agency is it, and I just can't imagine saying, it is going to do this. I'm curious as to why they say that. I mean, I see a ton of what I consider, arbitrary rules, but it's always interesting the background on that. So it is correct to say the agency. It may, or the office, but it may not be the most reader focused or user focused or or the friendliest. So I don't know if that helps. But it is correct. It's not incorrect.
The next question that we have here is, can we talk a lot about the use of pronouns and switching between first and third person?
Okay. I don't know if we can talk a lot about it, but I think the most important thing is to be consistent. You know, from a reader's perspective, from someone who comes to government agencies not for fun, but to find out, you know, like going to the Virginia DMV, what do I have to do to get this emissions inspection? You know, what I want is a consistent experience that answers my questions. I do not want to be left with more questions, and I don't want to have to try and figure out what they meant. You know, that's not something that I wish to do. And I think what I'm curious about is why they'd be switching first and third. Something that might solve that problem, however, is going to second person, because that would be focusing on the reader, you know, on the person reading the material and speaking directly to them. I realize that, you know, I get these questions sort of out of context, and I'm not 100% sure how to answer them, you know, without seeing any context. But I think that I would try doing it in second person, you know, with you, and see if that changes it. That may fix some things.
The example was US EPA is available on Saturday from 12 to 4. Come visit us.
Contact us, yeah. Contact us on Saturdays, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
I mean, because that also speaks directly to the reader. Not we're open, but you can contact us.
And then some of the other questions that we had here are related to restating the acronyms in each section. Whether or not you're supposed to do that, whether or not you restate acronym on each page or section, or
Oh,
which,
I think that my big question with, you know, section or page or whatever is it print or an email or digital? Because if it's digital, if it's one long, excuse me a second, one long page or something, or a long email, people might search for it, which is kind of disconcerting to find out that people search PDFs. Sorry about that. My handy dandy useful box of tissues. Um, but I think also, I mean, I was looking at a project once um, for reports that were submitted to Congress, and the rule for one agency was if it was mentioned, if an acronym was listed on two facing pages, it had to be spelled out on the left-hand page. I mean, it was a really Byzantine group of rules that I thought that must really make editing difficult. You know, editing to reflow pages, anything that would change it, because then you'd have to go back and add or delete the spelled out acronym.
so we have still a couple more questions here, but I know we're at
Mm-hmm.
the top of the hour. And do you
Oh,
want to,
go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
this one kind of follows the same suit,
Mm-hmm.
follows the same approach. Asking, is there a length at which an acronym is better? You wouldn't want to continuously repeat National Institutes of Environmental and Health Sciences. A lot of times it can be, a lot of time can be saved with NIES or
Mm-hmm.
NIEHS.
Yes, indeed. I think that's why they say try to make acronyms pronounceable. But you know, it is an exact point. Spelling them out all the time can be tedious. So can repeating the acronym. Um, you know, when you can shorten it and say we, whatever. Or to try and, and I'm just thinking, and again, this is without the benefit of seeing this in an actual example. I'm not sure how these would go. But, maybe you could, instead of having a paragraph, maybe you could have a bulleted list. The EPA section or whatever it was has the following responsibilities, bullet, 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 bullet. So you weren't repeating the name all the time. Is there a final question?
We have
next a final question.
I'll give you one extra one.
Okay.
There's a couple of questions here regarding inclusivity and of certain pronouns. And there's a lot of questions regarding the use of they or them or us or them, right? Can you kind of go in a little bit of perspective on whether or not plain language covers this inclusivity and what's the preference, or what is there any guidelines?
I don't think that there's a particular preference or even interpretation. I think that the grammatical sense, and I look at this from a very narrow standpoint, is or rather, do people understand, if they use a singular noun with a plural pronoun or a verb, or whatever it is, the one that does not distinguish gender. And I think people are understanding that okay. I mean, I'm not seeing that is likely to confuse the reader, which is generally, what I care about. I'm not sure that I'm answering the question properly, but I think that might very well be a grammar or style guide issue, which at least, AP style, which is what I focus on, has said, yeah, that's fine. So, any quarrel I might have with it is, if it's all right with AP style, okay with me. I realize that is not a comprehensive answer for those of you who do not use AP style.
Thanks, Catherine. I know you had a couple of other pieces to go through. Would you like to continue questions, or do you want to?
Yeah, we've got a big section on active and passive voice, so we might as well go ahead and see some of this. Yeah, with the questions.
Okay. So our state's laws have created several new terms that are jargon, such as leveraged procurement agreements for state contracts. Some senior leaders say that we should use that term because it's in the state statute, even though the public finds it difficult to understand. In these scenarios, what should be done?
I think in that case, if you're discussing a particular law and you're naming the exact law, you should name it, but then you get to say the law or it describes or whatever. I mean, that's, you can name it once so it's clear what you're referring to. I mean, it is very tricky to use plain language for proper nouns, which is, things that are named as opposed to generic. I mean, what you run the risk of is people not knowing what you're doing.
And then I think you covered the last one, which is the use of they or them as well.
Okay. Now, if it was in a different context than what I inferred, please add your question in the chat. And as I said, we'll be looking at the chat after the class. So I can perhaps have better answers, or at least more comprehensive ones.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much. Active voice, and this is still part of the choose words. Active and passive voice is something that people have a lot of difficulty with, and partially and this is certainly true. I haven't had a grammar class in a while. They don't think about voice. It's not in their professional wheelhouse. And, they don't think about it. But it does tend to have a little bit more influence than we think of. For example, there are two voices in English. Again, I'm only qualified to talk about English. And most English sentences are an active voice. That's an English sentence. Somebody does something. Subject plus verb, some object, and that's a sentence. Knowing who does what. The problem with passive is not that it's ungrammatical, it's that it buries who's doing what. And sometimes there are very good reasons for that, but you have to do them on purpose. You can't just fall into it. For example, in passive voice, the person or item that is acted upon, the receiver of the action, is the object. Passive sentences do not have to identify who is doing it. Who has had something done to them? Object plus verb plus by subject. So this is difficult because an English sentence relies on somebody doing something. For example, and this is often easier shown with examples than just here's a sentence. For example, active voice, they discuss the topic. The noun is they, the pronoun is they, the verb is discussed. What they discussed, the receiver of the action or the discussion was the topic. Subject, verb, direct object. In passive voice, it's been inverted. So while it is, again, completely grammatically correct, it's not often the best choice because what you have to do is whatever mental grammatical gyrations to get to they discussed the topic out of the topic was discussed by them. So you have the receiver of the action, the passive voice version of discussed, and who did the discussing? Them. So of the two, this is a lot more straightforward. You don't have to sort of disentangle the sentence and put it back together. You're not having to do that. Okay, the topic was discussed, they discussed the topic. So that is why active voice is easier to read. Now, as I've said, how can you spot passive voice besides, grammatical analysis, which, everybody does on their lunch hour? Can you add by zombies? Now, you can understand why this is such a popular solution. The store was entered. Unknown actor. We don't know who entered. Can you add by zombies? The store was entered by zombies. Yes, that's passive voice. Now we have something to make it active. Zombies entered the store. So if this is a little device to help you spot what the passive voice is, use it in health. I mean, that's a really helpful way to find out, is this sentence, passive voice, or does it need something added for it to make sense? How do you fix it? Now, sometimes all you have to do is recast the sentence, which is a pain, but at least if you've got all the information there, it's easy enough to do. The talking points were drafted by them. Who did the action? They. What was the action that they took? They drafted. What did they draft? The talking points. You do not want to read a lot of sentences, a lot of paragraphs, a lot of pages having to do this mental translating. So don't write it for your users. That's how you can fix it. Now, as I said, passive voice is grammatically correct. Sometimes you want to emphasize who or what received the action. Maybe that's more important. Maybe it's what's actually known at the time. For example, the city was bombed. Okay, it's more important that the city was bombed than naming who did it. Maybe you don't know, maybe it's less important. The idea was not encouraged. Maybe you do know who is not encouraging the idea, but you don't want to say, which leads me to when passive voice works. Your car has been stolen. You don't know by whom. And it's not helpful to say, a thief stole my car. Well, duh, that's kind of implied in the stealing. Presidents are elected every 4 years. The doer is obvious. You know, maybe it's more important that it's the receiver of the action. You get to decide with your sentences. Her outfit was covered with glitter. The doer doesn't matter. You know, doesn't matter who covered it with glitter. More important, the receiver of the glitter. All annual leave has been canceled. Doer best left unnamed. You know, it's probably the head of your agency. You don't necessarily want to throw that kind of odium on them. Or the report should have been done by, it avoids a direct attack. Maybe that's, you know, not something you want to emphasize. You know, so there are some good reasons for using the passive voice, but in general, active voices, you know, use active voice instead. You know, you've got a very limited limited list of where passive voice would be the best choice, but don't overdo it. These are very rare. I would say like 95% of the time, active voice is your friend. It is much more easily understood by your audience. So when you use passive voice, you know, when you're using it precisely, do it on purpose. Do it when it's appropriate. Don't leave it to your audience to figure out who's doing what. Make that really obvious. And in fact, if there's any advice I could give to people writing in the government, is make it obvious. Do not try, you know, write for your audience. Please make it obvious what we need to do. I don't like personally reading too much background. Sometimes I just don't care. What do you want me to do? One of the stories that I think got me into this field of plain language was my dad, who was a executive in the Army Corps of Civil Engineers. And he would come home from work and say what he had for lunch, and you know, the office shenanigans, always a fun topic. And one day he came home and said, Bob, you know, Bob, guess what Bob did? He left a 12-page memo on my dad's chair, because this was before email. So my dad sat down and read this 12-page memo. And after he read it, he wrote Bob a little note saying, Bob, what do you want me to do? Now, think about that. That's 12 pages, which is not something written quickly. It was 12 pages, which is not necessarily something that's read particularly quickly if you're reading with a great deal of attention to detail. And after that, my dad still had to say, what do you want me to do? What's the thing with memos? Generally not 12 pages, just a guess. But what he should have had to do should have been obvious, really, really obvious. So passive voice, don't leave it to your audience to figure out. Please make it obvious what you want them to do, which gets us back to reader-centered organization. Okay, so I totally got this messed up. So I am going to copy this so we can, no, I'm not. We're going to go on and I'll show passive voice videos later on at the next break. And let me write that down. Help me remember, Rhett, that I'm going to show videos because I think they're really important. It's before we do the exercises. Okay, thanks. Hidden verbs are verbs that have been converted into a noun, and they often need an extra noun to make sense. Now, this comes up a great deal. This is one of the, to me, easiest edits. If you're looking to reduce the length of your paragraphs or your sentences, this is a great place to start. And this is real, as I said, relatively easy to spot and to fix. So they're often ones. Instead of present a report, where report is a noun here, you can just report. And instead of doing an assessment of, you can just assess. So this finding, rescuing hidden verbs is a lot of fun, I always think. Provide assistance to, you can place with assistance or help. Came to the conclusion. I had a boss who always used came to the conclusion until she, you know, sent me something, said, can you look at this? Can you edit this for me? I'm reporting into a call later today. And I, was going through rescuing hidden verbs, and I changed it to, came to the conclusion to concluded. And she chatted back and said, she said, oh, I see you changed, came to the conclusion to concluded. Where'd you get that from? And I said, oh, well, conclusion is the noun form of the verb conclude, which means to finish. And that's, where I got that. And some days later, we were both on the same webinar where somebody said, I conversated with her. And in 2 seconds, my boss and I were chatting because she said conversated. And, I was thinking to myself, oh, this could go so wrong, but conversated, I said, well, technically it's from conversation, but we already have converse, and even better than that, speak, talk, or say. So rescuing hidden verbs, is generally straightforward. And sometimes you hear them, sometimes people make up words, which is always fun. I was reading the Washington Post a couple years ago and saw two terms that astounded me. One was a news story about Queen Elizabeth II, and the article listed her as having been coronated in whatever the year was, 1953, I think. Coronated. And I thought about that for a minute, and I thought, okay, they took that from coronation, but literally there's already a word for that, which is crowned. So sometimes when you see these verb forms, people are not necessarily thinking we already have a word for that. We really do all of that. And on social media, I once saw the word, no, another post article, I saw a quote that had the word wardrobed, and I was looking at that word thinking, wardrobed, I can guess what that means, but they should have just used dressed. It was a weird article about couture, I think. But I mean, it was just interesting to be sort of minding my own business, not reading stuff for work, and coming up with, people are inventing words out of the noun forms, probably because they don't know that there's already a word, maybe. So this is how you sort of sneak into linguistics, whether you want to or not. So I just wanted to include those because I thought those were kind of fun examples for that. When you're working to sentences, when you're writing your sentences, and again, as I say, I don't care, I don't think anyone cares how you get to your draft, because it could be a ton of different things. You could speak it and translate it into speech, or you can just random type. You can use an outline, you can not use an outline, you can just free associate, whatever works for you to get words down. But plain language comes, I think, with the rewriting. You don't want to tell yourself you have to draft in plain language, because that's really limiting. Let your ideas, get your ideas out, and then start structuring them. So as you're writing sentences, look for redundancies and cliches. Try and reduce clauses to phrases and phrases to words. This is, tightening sentences. Take out the unnecessary ones. And use concrete rather than vague language. I mean, we were talking about some of the jargon we were finding vexing. And as I said, uncertain times is winning that for me right now. Instead of these uncertain times, how about August 2020 or summer of 2020? I like things pinned down. I do not like a lot of room for interpretation if it's communication. And pay attention to your word order. These you would have seen at any point as you look at what are things that need to be closer together. Any editing exercises will show that. And another element is, how do you move from sentences to paragraphs? Now, one of the things we see a lot of is paragraphs that are too long. And so one of the things I do is often say, why don't you break here? Whenever you have a new idea, whenever you're contrasting information ideas, when you want to give your readers a break, and you'll see some of the examples. If you're ending your introduction and moving on to the main section, if you're starting your conclusion, make that clear with design, with a new space, because that often means to people new idea or a new part of an idea. And when you realize that one paragraph is 2 pages long, that's a good time to start a new paragraph. These are just some of the hints as you're rewriting. As I said before, be obvious. As the journalists say, don't bury your lead. This is what they call a hard lead project. I'm not entirely sure. NASA is proposing another space project. The budget requests approximately $10 billion for the project. This middle part is the justification for the 10 billion. But be obvious. Make it really simple to get what your main point is. The soft lead. We're going to the moon again. NASA announcement came as the agency requested 10 billion of appropriations for the project. So a slight difference, but they are getting to the point. These are things to consider again as you're writing. Are you making your point obvious? Are you putting your conclusion first is a helpful way to do that. Some other points, this is again part of the rewriting process. You've drafted, you've considered your audience, you've organized, you've written your content. Sometimes you have to step back and say, can I present the information in a better way? And I will say that that is the very hardest thing for me to do. I mean, there's some things I'm good at, and then other things I'm just like, I don't know, I don't get this. And then that's where it helps if you have someone else who can review, if not the entire thing, then a section, and then you can get an idea of what they're focusing on. For example, we talked a little bit about bulleted lists when we were talking about the techniques at the beginning. One of the things that bulleted lists do is make it easy for the reader to see that there's a list of items or steps in a process, and that depends, on whether you're using numbers or letters or just bullets. It also can show the structure of the bulleted list, that some things come underneath it. It helps a lot to give blank space around it. One of the things you'll see later is a heat map where we look at how people read material, and generally online, because that's what they can use the heat map for. But it also shows shows the reader your document structure and the relationship between a thesis or a theme or an introduction and the supporting evidence. So that is very useful. It also gives people something to focus on. For example, sorry, um, this, the laws that CRC enforces forbid discrimination on the following basis, blah, 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 blah. Now, it's very, very difficult to read across when you have items in a list because, your eye falls, your eye slides to the next one. It is easy to miss items in a list if they're in paragraph form. If, however, you put it into a list, yeah, Civil Rights Center, CRC, enforces laws that do not allow discrimination because of list, list, list. And, a long list, but still all of it goes. In fact, just seeing that word and seeing the colon there makes me think list. This should be a list. And even now, I can't actually imagine that you'd have to save paper. I mean, I know that that used to be a consideration, that you'd want things going across and you wouldn't use bulleted list because it might increase the pagination. But now things are online or electronic or digital, and you can have that space. So bulleted lists make things much easier. Had I been thinking about this a little bit more, I might have, there are two ways of doing this. I might have put it in alphabetical order because one thing that people do is if they're reading a list, they say, what order is this in? Now, I might have put it in alphabetical order to have it make sense. Or I might have said, maybe I need to follow the law precisely. It's a question I'd actually check on because, maybe something has to be in a particular order. I can't really imagine why, but, experience, maybe this is something that we would need to do. Another point, and this is one of the few parallelism things, the grammatical things that I mentioned a little earlier. In lists, you often have to make sure that things are parallel. This is kind of like the Sesame Street game. Some of these things are kind of together, some of these things are kind of the same. Can you guess which one doesn't belong? And what that means is that generally, these items in a list should match. So you have each compact must contain provisions are and are. So that doesn't make sense. That's not parallelism. So we're going to look at this again. Each compact, this is where you make it match the header and see if it works. And it does not. This compact must contain provisions required by the Tribal Self-Governance Act of 1994. Okay, that is okay. Each compact must contain are in compliance. Okay, so that doesn't work. And each compact must contain are consistent with this part. So these are not parallel. I mean, sometimes you really have to look at every single thing. So how would you fix that? What you change it to is each compact must contain provisions, verb, comply with other applicable federal laws, yeah, and be consistent with this part. Now, there might be, I would be happier if there was another verb here, simply because I'm not a huge fan of be plus an adjective, but this makes more sense. This makes parallel sense. So that is something, whenever you're going to have a list, you do have to make sure they're parallel. That helps people a lot understand how are things, how are things together. Another thing, and sometimes this is really useful, tables can clarify things a lot. I don't know how many of you have to make um, estimated payments, quarterly payments to the IRS. I had to do that for a while. And the IRS used to send out a little booklet, says estimated tax, here are your coupons, and you find the address of where you have to send it. And that was always a pain because it was double column, like 8.5 by 11, and you had to read every line to find out where you sent it. Well, all of a sudden, they sent out a much smaller booklet with the coupons, and they said, okay, if you live in the following states, Virginia, North Carolina, West Virginia, something else, send your payment to Pittsburgh. And I was like, this is fantastic. I do not have to read line by line until I find my state. I can just look in the left-hand column, and in the right-hand column is where I'm supposed to send it. That is really useful. Now, what that does is, as a table, it can really save words. It can really clarify meaning. It can make it easy to locate specific provisions. If then, if this state, then this address. You can take in complex material much more easily, and it can make your logic and structure clear. As I said, if then statements would do very well. So tables can be very helpful, and we have some exercises later on that we'll be going through. For example, table. And this is, just imagine this in a paragraph. If the irregularity is up to $10,000, then an accountable officer may, this is what he or she would do. So you have the dollar amount and then a certain action. And that is a lot easier than having to, read through a paragraph, trying to find, where's the irregularity amount, and then what do I do? Because that means you often have to look at things twice. So tables can be very useful. One of the things that I think people have mentioned is people read slower on the web and they scan for information. That's, when we were looking at headers. We also have an issue of people's offline behaviors beginning to echo online. So people are scanning paper in the way that they used to only scan online or on the web. So online readers focus on headings and bulleted lists. Those are the key attractors of their attention. So you have to really make your content count, and you have to cut your content, but it's not your only goal. Just having it shorter doesn't help unless it's more clear as well. Be clear even if you end up adding words, because that's what people need. And this, sometimes if you're explaining a word of jargon, you have to use extra words to explain what that means. That's okay. It's not the only guarantee of plain language. So one of the things I talked about was eye tracking, how people can tell what what people are looking for, and people read, it's called the F shape. They go down the left-hand side, they're attracted to bulleted lists, and they look at headings because they're looking for guidance. Where's the information that I want? Now, some people, and I have started doing this myself, just hit Control F. I'm not even going to look at the page. I'm looking for something very specific. I want to know where it comes up. So this is the Nielsen Norman Group. They do a lot of usability training and a lot of classes, and they have articles. I think they come out every week. They've got a great deal of good information about web information architecture, content, very, very valuable source of information. Here's where we talked about if we were in a classroom rather, I would say, raise your hand when you stop reading. So we could pretend that I asked that. But, there's some problems with this. It is a big block of text. It is what I have called a wall of words. This is really hard to get through. Why is it all at once? Now, we can look at it and say, okay, there's some things we can do. And the first thing we can do is we can make this 2 paragraphs. It's very subtle, but this is actually 2 paragraphs instead of 1. So I might have added something extra. Now, what else can we do? We have 2 numbered lists. So obviously one thing we could do is make those lists more obvious. I did the first paragraph just to show you. For example, this 1, 2, 3. So you can imagine that, this second one would do as well. It would have 6 numbers in the list. So we have that, and that's easier. That's a little better. But and this is something that you'll have to judge for yourself every time you're writing something. This is all you need. So there's this. There's the time reformatting these. And then there's what's actually required. So it's also always useful to ask, what's required to answer this? What do people need to know? Don't give them this, and I'm sorry for the fast scrolling. Don't give them this if all they need is that. One of the biggest points of the reader-centered organization we've been looking at. So self-editing steps. It is very difficult to do nonstop plain language. It's very hard to do that, nonstop editing or reviewing, and that's true of editing in general. I mean, you're just trying to pay attention to everything. So, one of the things I try and tell people is you take a break. I can often do about, I would say, 8 to 10 pages before I have to come up for air. Then it's generally tea time. I choose, how am I going to do this? Am I going to have to read this? I try not to do that too much, but sometimes you just have to pull out a reader and read it line by line. You have to concentrate. You have to take your time. You're checking for a number of different things. Are things flowing? Are things clear? Are there logical steps? And another thing is the agency's message coming through? Sometimes you can say this contradicts that. I've been working on a couple of, I guess, like white papers, playbooks, stuff. And sometimes I have to say, I don't understand the reasoning behind this. Is your audience going to know about that? Are these conclusions borne out? Is that true even now? Like, is this still the case with people actually not in the buildings? I was looking at a big childcare document, and I was working on it in March, and then of course when these uncertain times, I said, does this even apply? Is this something you want to be putting out now when people are going to have a couple of different questions about childcare design? That is now the right time for it. If you can, get some colleagues to look at things for you. I've benefited so much from other people, other people's help when I've said, I am just really stuck. I don't know how to get through this. What are they even trying to say? And sometimes the answer is they're not explaining it very clearly. And sometimes it's something I didn't know. So sharing with others. And something that I've been trying to do for groups, for teams I've been working with, is how do we get patterns out of some of the comments I've been making? For example, one of the things I'm always trying to do, to be fair, is to say, can I do a sample page for you, and then maybe you could go through and look yourself? And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But for example, sometimes there are places where there's just a lot of not childcare, there's a lot of passive voice construction. And so, I could go through, or I could say, you have a lot of passive voice construction, things that maybe shouldn't be. Can you go through and check specifically for that? Because that presumably will help them learn how that's going to work. It's also helpful to say, I've done this one page to show you how you could break up your paragraphs a little bit better. Can you take that lesson throughout your own document? And sometimes that works and sometimes it does not. Some shall we say, teams are more open to that than others. But it's helpful to at least see, is this something out of a pattern, or is this something that they just sort of need to know for the future? So I believe, yep, that is the end of this. Before we move to some videos and some exercises, are there any questions that you have before I move to those?
Yeah, we have a couple of questions here.
Great.
So the first one is, uh, if we cite the name of the law, should we explain in plain language what the law requires? I think we went over this, but just to review.
Is this specifically the Plain Writing Act, or any law?
Any law.
Oh, okay, any law. Yes, if you can do that, because honestly, if you don't, people will either try and guess, or they'll look it up themselves. So if you could, for example, if I were doing that with the Plain Writing Act, I would say Plain Writing Act of 2010, the law that made plain language mandatory for the federal government. I think that helps, because sometimes people, there's a lot of laws. I think it's also always very helpful to make it clearer. But that's just a suggestion. That's not part of the techniques or the law.
The next question is kind of a broad question, but do you know of any plain Spanish courses?
Plain Spanish courses. I do not. I know that a couple of South American countries have started, I think Chile are starting plain language programs, or have started. And I know that my normal contacts are Laura Godfrey and Leilana Martinez. I can ask around. If you can, if that's in the chat, I will try and track that down.
And for those of you not reading the chat, there was a recommendation before that plainlanguage.gov includes some documents from Mexico at least. So there may be
Yeah.
there too. The next question here is, you are writing something to the public about the law. Can you state/cite the law, but must you use jargon terms in the law? For example, under the National Contingency Plan regulations,
Mm,
we prioritize partnering with local companies to compete with removal actions. We could say
yeah.
cleanup.
Um, I'm kind of sighing because the plain language law is not particularly clear, which is really kind of vexing. I think that I would focus literally on what you wanted your reader to do. And I'm not trying to be picky about that. It's just, do people need to know the law? I mean, do they need to know the language of the law itself? I would certainly say, from this law, you know, you must, or you are required to, or, whatever the action you want to take. But I would emphasize the actions rather than the law itself. And I'm sorry to sound weaselly, which I'm afraid I am, but I would also run that by a lawyer to say, I don't want to just quote the law at them because, it's not necessarily helpful or whatever the phrase is, but can I say this?
It's like you're getting some confirmation in the chat to the same effect.
Excellent, excellent.
Consult your lawyer if you can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, okay. So the next question is, I've also been told not to use both active and passive voice in a document/paragraph, but once in a while, passive voice just sounds better. Can we use passive voice for one sentence in a paragraph and then use active voice for the rest of the paragraph?
I've never heard that rule. Um, wow. Yeah, I think that what I would do is look at the sounding better and run it up against the other possibilities. Where the slide that says when plain language, when passive voice is correct, and see if it falls into that. I have found sometimes that my ear can lead me astray, so I have to be careful about that. But yeah, see if the case you're looking at falls into one of the points where it's actually correct. And maybe the person who gave you that instruction is concerned that it will sound contradictory or something. I don't know. Maybe you could move that passive voice sentence to another paragraph or its own paragraph. I don't know. It's really hard to give general rules when I don't have an example, to look at and say, oh, this is it.
The next question is is around slide 59 and 60 regarding tables,
Mm-hmm.
line of tables.
Mm-hmm.
Can you use the word align in this part whenever you're talking about?
I'm going to go back to the table section and see. Sorry if I'm making anyone dizzy. Tables.
It's around 59 and 60.
Okay. I'm not sure where the word align comes in.
The term used was be consistent.
Oh, that was parallelism.
Oh, okay.
I think this one, align. Yeah, I think align would work very well. Yeah, align with this part.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And what about tips on editing others' work? Some people get very defensive whenever.
No. Oh no, I'm sort of sighing in recognition. Yeah. Well, I've learned a couple of things the very hard way, which is always ask them what their deadline is and be realistic. Sometimes it's, can you look at this by the end of the day? And the answer is yes. Sometimes it's no. Um, I've often, people send me things sometimes unsolicited, and, I go back to what do you want me to look for? Am I looking for logic? Am I doing plain language? Is it convincing? I mean, what, yeah, because I think everyone's learned maybe the hard way for them that they can't just send me something and expect A plus, check marks, smiley faces, that's if people ask me to look, I assume they're sincere. Um, so sometimes that can be tricky. I have asked people, what am I looking for? What do you want me to look for? And, sometimes it's, does it read okay? Does it make sense? And then, I look at it and I'm like, you kind of lose control over your argument in paragraph 3. I don't know what you're doing in paragraph 3. Um, it's very tricky. As I said, I had to learn all of these lessons the hard way. Um, find out, yeah, find out if you're actually able to do it, and if you're able to do it justice. Like, if it's 100 pages and they give it to you at 5 o'clock and they want it like 9 o'clock the next morning, no, no. I mean, unless they realize that it's going to take probably, you know, most of your night and some of the morning. I mean, you have to be realistic with what you're willing to do and for whom. Um, I'd say also if it's a colleague or a teammate who has helped you, then definitely you should, extend yourself because, that sometimes things flow a little bit. But I have found that I have to ask people what their deadlines are. And even this is a ridiculous answer, but it certainly happened. I had to ask, I've learned I've had to ask, can I edit the document? Or do you just want comments? And just doing comments is really difficult. But now that GSA uses Google, so I turn my edits into suggestions so that they see the logic of what I've changed. Sometimes people argue with me in the comments and I'm like, I'm actually not going back and reading it, so you can take it or not. But I'm not sure that answers your question. um, Decide if you can do it, decide if you can fit it in, decide if the person, you know there's a couple of different things. I don't like saying no, but sometimes, like, if I've reviewed something for somebody and they weren't gracious about it, then I'm much less likely to review their stuff.
So I got a little more
Yeah,
specificity here.
excellent.
What if it's your job to edit,
Well, then you're screwed. I mean, you have to edit. Um,
and you are given a realistic time frame?
okay.
What are some of the tips to like not offend the person with the work? So like that's suggestions and Google may be one example, but other
Suggestions in Google or track changes in a Word document. I find that that's a huge safeguard for me. I mean, not only that they see the logic of what I'm changing, but if I'm asked, why did you make this edit? I'm not sitting there thinking, I don't know, because I'll have the edit and the original. And that's a huge safeguard. If people ask, why did you change this? So I find that that is very helpful. um, i've had I had a little experience with something called a 65 and a 90% edit, and I'm still trying to decide what I thought about that, because it wasn't so much what I consider line editing, but it was making comments in a spreadsheet, like page 27, second paragraph, first column, this is verbose, and as I obviously that's what they wanted, so they got a lot of entries like that. But I thought, they're really making it hard on themselves, and it's difficult for me also when I'm reviewing to say, Okay, verbose. Do they know how to fix verbose? Or lack of parallelism with the headers or whatever? So, I mean, that was an interesting spreadsheety editing example. I'm not sure how useful it was, because when I saw the 90% version, I was back to this this page is verbose. This page has too much content. This is too repetitive. You're using passive voice all over the place. And I didn't know if that was enough guidance for people to be able to actually fix something. So it's interesting. Oh gosh, I always treat it like an adventure. Like, what am I going to learn? And sometimes what I learn is, I wish I didn't have to do this. Sometimes it's, wow, this was a really interesting project, or I got to pull out some different editing skills that I haven't used for a while, or man, I always forget to proofread headers, or what's the thing when you have an illustration and you have the caption for it or whatever. I always forget that. And that in itself is useful.
It looks like we have some agreement additions in the chat.
Great.
From Julie, it looks like, as an editor, I would also say, do you want a quick review, a deep review, or especially on tight time frames, just to make it clear the kind of work that can be delivered. It's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
setting expectations. So
Yeah. And I will say that, like most everything, I have learned all of that the hard way. You know, because sometimes you raise questions and they're like, that's not really part of your job. And I'm like, well, that part of the document didn't make sense given the rest of the document. So, sometimes that's just the case. What we're looking at now is some exercises, which if we were in a class sharing, sharing personal space, we would be working through some of these. And some of these are just going to have to be sort of chime along. I'm not sure how helpful the chat function is going to be with those, but we'll be going through at least some of the plain language exercises so you can have an idea of, sort of how plain language works in the wild. So, some of these, and I have to say that the curse of knowledge is definitely applying here because I've been using these for some time. And, sometimes it's hard to work my way back to what was it like to be beginning in plain language and, not necessarily knowing how everything was fitting together. But one of the things, I mean, I'll be doing these on the screen, and I have this very giant piece of Post-it note saying scroll slowly. So I'm going to try my hardest to do that because I'm told, and I've certainly suffered from this enough, I'll get seasick or you'll get seasick if I don't. So I'm going to be scrolling slowly. So one of the questions is, how do you, substitute pronouns for nouns? How do you rewrite sentences? And how do you add pronouns? And because you can see, must be provided is passive voice. Who's supposed to do it? And the answer is you must provide copies of your tax returns. Autocorrect is always interesting. So you're moving from a couple of things. You're moving from passive voice to active, and you're adding the pronoun. Technically, you would just have to add your is something to remember. I've seen a lot of sentences where people have not done the switch throughout. So, somebody has to look at that. Another way, simply because it's a possible question, is if you're going to make it command voice, and that's also known as the imperative, it's when you're giving orders. You take out the pronoun or the noun and you just do the second person voice, which is provide. copies of your tax returns. You may have seen this as the understood you. This is huge when you're giving directions. It's should be obvious from the context and explicitly that you are being told how to do something, so you have to do those things. Provide copies of your tax return, show up on time, bring a photo ID, all of those things. But you also have to look sometimes at the logic. And I want to apologize for my voice because it feels like I haven't talked for hours at a time for some time. So I'm hoping it's not giving out too badly. For loan applications will be reviewed to ensure that procedures have been followed. Okay, sometimes there are logic problems in sentences that you have to tease out. For example, you wouldn't start this with review loan applications because you're not giving the command to someone else. Who's going to be doing the reviewing? Or the bank or whatever. We will review your loan application to, I'm tired of insure, but that's a personal thing. Who's doing what? You have to look at that. So you've got passive voice here will be reviewed and have been followed by whom. So you've got who's doing what. We or the bank or the agency or whatever will review your loan application to make sure you have followed procedures or even our procedures. You don't have to be too definitive. I mean, there's a couple of different ways that sentence would go, but you would obviously, if this were an actual sentence and not just an example, you would have more context for what was going on. So for this is useful because you can start it, you will be the primary source. That's what happens when you type too quickly. Regarding, and this is being thorough again, regarding your circumstances. And this is where you can get into some plain language substitutions. Instead of for the purposes of determining, something you can use, and this is rescuing a hidden verb, to typo. So that, is how you work your way out of that. Instead of the applicant, you, the person reading these instructions. This is how you move from third person to second. Let's see. Okay. To establish your eligibility for a voucher, you must show that you have a low income and your present housing is substandard and inadequate. So you're moving again to speaking more directly using pronouns. So to establish your eligibility for a voucher, you must show that you have a low income and your present housing, or you must show that your income is low. That is more parallel, but parallelism isn't everything. That's simply one of the possible answers. Rhett, am I scrolling too quickly?
You're looking good.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's see. I feel like we've done that, so I wanted to move on to this one. We have some time for that. Now look at what is happening. Okay. And these are all government examples. So a government at some level. Generally, we work on federal agencies, but we get examples from everywhere. Okay, this one is tricky. This initiative works to educate specific underserved communities too, and this is where bullets would come in handy. Recognize and report intolerance and hate crimes, assist victims in, accessing. We didn't talk about too much like this, but instead of accessing, I think that I would use getting. It's a word that is understood in a number of different contexts. Or, okay, I'm going to go back to that. Assist victims in getting culturally and linguistically appropriate services, and advocate on behalf of victims for institutional changes that can reduce hate crimes. Okay. So this shows a change in format, how bulleted lists can help break open complicated things. The other thing, this is something that I feel that I see a great deal, and I'm almost at the point where I'm doing it automatically. Instead of assist victims in getting, help victims to get culturally and linguistically appropriate services. So that is probably something that I would keep in track changes or, suggestions, so that people could see, what am I working? What am I looking to do? Another one, this one, this is tricky because this is not only a logic problem, but it's also dreadfully outdated. And, it's just kind of funny looking back at it. But let's see, in most cases, I'm going to abbreviate this, California Small Business Certification or Nonprofit Registration. Okay, passive voice, I'm going to make that active. You can complete your registration in one online in, one business day or less. So this is the logic problem. You can do it in one business day or less if you have all the necessary information. So I would put that first, because that's an indicator that you have to have those things. If you have your tax returns and business documents to hand, yeah. So in most cases, if you have your tax returns and business documents to hand, you can complete your certification or registration online in one business day or less. And the reason I'm laughing is, how could it take one day? I mean, that's a sign of terrible usability as far as I'm concerned. There's no way it could take an entire day. But that's is there a question?
There's some commentary in the chat about even removing things like your and some other pieces to just make it even more streamlined.
Yeah. There's a lot of, we get examples, and sometimes we get examples completely divorced from context, which means we have to make certain decisions. And the thing that I wonder about sometimes is, instead of to hand, which I think may be either an old-fashioned or a regional expression, maybe if you have your tax returns and business documents ready. I don't know.
Yeah, there's some other commentary about two hand, on hand, in hand.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's why I said it may be a regionalism, because how else can you um, determine? So this is lists, and what I'm going to do is just go into the original. So, oh wait, I think I'll just copy it. That might be easier. This is the focus is on doing lists, which doesn't mean that there may be other things that we could fix, but we're looking at one thing. One of the things that you do want to look when you're creating new bulleted lists is parallelism within the thing, because that will indicate really that there's something. For example, failure to file an answer within the 30-day period may be treated as consent to the award requested unless the department or other agency requests an extension of time for filing or files a statement of intent. So what that means is you've got that, and I'm adding some punctuation here out of habit. So that is the two things that can be bulleted because they already match: requests or files. Those are the two things that the department or other agency can do. So that is useful. It's always useful looking for that pattern. And speaking of patterns, this one may be a little tricky. It's what are the things that are parallel? You have to look at the structure before you can make any edits. So we have specifying, we have explaining, we have including, and we have delivered. So let's try something. Let's make the verb. So we've got, that's not going to work. Specifying, and we have explaining, and we have will be delivered, and we have this. So two things match, two things work. One works, the other won't. I'm taking out this. Also going to add one of these, including your appeal rights under, I'm going to not do the section one. But one thing we can't do is add this. That's not going to work. We specifying, explaining, including, delivering to you. That's not going to work. We're going to have to keep that non-parallel, take it out of the list, because that's just not going to work. And we had a student come back to us after a class one day and say that's a kicker sentence, kicker statement. Wouldn't fit into the parallel, but had to be included, just couldn't be made parallel. It's just not going to work. So I'm going to try one more with the list. We seem to have time. Are there questions, Rhett?
Yeah, there's a couple of good questions about kind of like what's redundant versus what's not, and it's on some of these. Let's see. There's things like whenever you say 30-day period, is the period redundant? Can you just say within?
That's interesting. I was thinking that as I was glancing at it. It's not necessarily something I'm focusing on. As I said, some of these are picked for a particular example, which doesn't mean that other things don't apply. Within the 30-day period, I think that I might have tried to edit at least, or at least brought it up. Can we say within 30 days? Is that 30 business days? Or, within the period? 30-day period, I don't know. People can get very picky, and sometimes it will depend on the office, which is, we don't have perfect consistency of plain language, throughout anywhere.
And the other two questions that are coming in just now
Mhm.
is it better to take the ing off the verb? Gerund verbs that end with the letters ing act like a noun.
Um, they can, but in this case, these are, I think, adjectives explaining what the written notice is doing. So I don't think, if we change the sentence, we'll provide you a written notice that specifies, explains, and includes. The one lesson, or at least one lesson that I hope you remember, is that sometimes when you make one change, you have to go through and make sure that that hasn't affected other changes. That's just an editorial note that, again, I have learned the hard way.
So, the next question is a broad question. How do you change the culture in the office around plain language sounding harsh to the reader?
Oh, um, I would say, and this is something I think about a lot, I would say that I try to combine the carrot and the stick. And the stick, of course, is the Plain Writing Act, where I say, oh, is that being published, for everybody, for, general audience? Doesn't that need to be in plain language? And, sometimes I would just say, and I think this is true of any agency, that some offices are better than others in being responsive or even thinking about plain language. Some are not at all. Some mistakenly think they're exempt. I try a lot more to do the carrot, which is I'd be happy to look at that for you and let you know. Or would you like me to come do a lunch and learn, or one of those, just something where I can come in and talk for 30 minutes at your team meeting about plain language and what it means and what your responsibilities are. That's a very big question, and I think that you have to be very much a promoter of plain language, and to let others know. So, if there's any newsletters or things like that, you could not only say, can I put something about plain language in the newsletter, but can I look at your newsletter for plain language? Just, because it's give and take. People have to be willing to let you look at their stuff, and you have to be willing to look at their stuff and put the work in so that they see the value. Another thing that I have found, and then I think this is specifically because of the agency I'm in, we are mission support, and I was in a very business oriented division. And I said, we need to be clear, not because being clear is our civic duty, but because we will also reach our customers better. We're dealing with a very complicated subject, information technology. We want them to buy from us, we want their contracts. We have to be clear. And that particular argument made more sense than there's this law. You have to tie it to their interests, and whether that interest is education or recruitment or answering questions or following the right thing. You have to find that out from your agency and make the plain language argument to fit that.
In a similar way, there's a comment in the chat from Stacy regarding how only out of 4 US adults have a college degree. So
Yep,
you're blocking people from accessing information if you
yep,
don't make it in plain language.
yep. That is definitely a case. And if your content is dedicated to a very particular audience, you've got to find out about the audience. But that is not only knowing your audience and reader-centered organization, but it's why else are you doing it? You know, I assume that everyone wants to do a good job. And sometimes there are constraints like, deadlines or someone's out of the office and sometimes things don't happen, but there's often an opportunity to revisit. So, okay, just a few more exercises, unless you'd like to go to all questions, you know.
That's all the questions I have, unless
Okay,
anyone else has more in the chat. Feel free to
well,
drop.
yeah. Okay, this is again grammatical for looking for what's parallel, and I can only do this, zoot, sorry for cursing. Um, Looking for what is parallel because that will show me how to punctuate. You must be able to show how you calculated and how you complied. Now, I might look at this and say, and then make, and how you complied with this subpart's requirements. One of the things that I found can often be a little cloggy is the prepositional phrases, requirements of this subpart. You can also make this subpart's requirements, and you've made the relation clearer. You've, tightened a sentence a little bit. Maybe you can do that. Um, it's worthwhile looking at it, and considering that kind of edit. Let's see. Oh, okay. Here we go. For those of you who had questions about tables, this is a really useful one. One of the things that I found frequently confuses people is, what do you use for the headers? And I think people confuse what to use for the headers and what to use in the items, and therefore they don't find tables particularly useful. But let's see. We've got estimated stumpage value, and we've got dollar amount. And once you've got that, it does make sense. You've got, I'm abbreviating rather ruthlessly here. One thing we have is the stumpage value. So I'm putting that in, and that's 50K, under 50K, 50 to 250K, and over 250K. And then the question is, sorry, I was wrong. Number of days ad runs. And it's simply a question of plugging it in. You look here, and if it's under 50,000, you have to run the ad for 15 days. And if it's that, technically, I'm looking at this, not less than 30 days. Sorry. This is an experiment on how poorly I can type while on video. And then not less than 60 days. And it's a lot easier if you think about it, if you know your estimated stumpage value. And I found just a few months ago that a friend of mine actually does have estimated stumpage value from a tree farm she owned that her dad left her. So I felt very pleased to know that. So if you know the value of this, you know how long the ad has to run, and you don't have to wade through a series of if-then statements. This is not going to be universally applicable, but another point where it is, sorry, I think I might have been scrolling too fast. This is action or decision, no numbers but words, but this is a workflow. So you have action and decision, And then you have appeal to. So if you, who made it? Agency superintendent, area director, and commissioner. And then if the agency superintendent made it, you can appeal to the area director. And if the area director made it, you can appeal to the commissioner. And if the commissioner made it, there's no appeal. But again, think about, instead of wading through this, and people can get lost in this very easily, they look at this, they look at the table. Who made the decision? Whom can I appeal to? Part of it is respecting our audience and making things easy, being straightforward with things. Okay, I'm going to be adding that checklist at the end, but that is pretty much what I had. Are there any questions, more questions that you have that I can ask about plain language in general, or the plain language action and information network, or future training, or practically anything?
We have a question here. What's the next level of training?
That is a very good question. We have in the past, and when I say we, I mean the plain action and information network trainers have offered a web writing class, which is, this class with more web examples. We have been wondering what sort of thing people are looking for. We were thinking of a second, not so much an advanced class, but the next steps, but we weren't sure what topics people were interested in. And whether that would be medium, whether it's web or digital or writing email or social media. I have taught a social media class, but if it would be something like playbooks or white papers or things like that.
Catherine, do you want me to launch the last poll that we have here? And then there's still
Oh,
some,
please, yeah.
because I think before people drop, we just want to know, here, I'll launch the poll. Do you feel comfortable starting or continuing to edit in plain language based upon this event and this training? Getting a lot of great responses here.
Hooray! And something for you to add in the chat, or if you have further ideas, if you don't feel comfortable editing or writing in plain language, what's standing in your way, or what would help? What would help you?
And then while we have the poll open, I'm just going to ask you a couple other questions here, Catherine.
Sure.
Oh, how do you negotiate plain language with lawyers?
That's actually a great question, because I would not say that lawyers are necessarily resistant to plain language. I mean, I don't think it ever helps to go in assuming people hate plain language. What lawyers are very often interested in is compliance with the law. And I haven't necessarily myself had successes or failures on that. But what I've heard as a good tactic is explain to them that the language of the law or whatever might get in the way of compliance because people may not understand it. I think I rarely think you succeed saying, "Oh, that's a terrible idea," but saying, "We want you to help. We want you to help. We want to help you meet your goals even more. We want this to work. We want people to be able to understand what you want them to do, and then go do it." And to that end, we have to make it something they understand, because your audience is not necessarily lawyers. So I think if I were negotiating things like that, that is what I would say.
And we have a couple of more questions here. What's the next level of training? What would you call the next level of training?
Well, as I said, web writing is one area, or social media, but some of it is, we have to get questions from people. People say, "Do you offer this?" And we say sometimes yes, or sometimes no. For example, we used to have someone who could teach regulations writing, but he retired from the federal government, and we can only use people who are feds, who have gone through our training, to teach plain language. So part of it is for me to turn the question back to you and say, what kind of training are you interested in? Are you interested in, and this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, like the review process. How do you review things for plain language? What do you look for? Are you looking for stakeholder expectations management? Which, I'm not entirely sure I'm the right person to check with, but I mean, that's something. Are you looking at writing forms or surveys? These are not necessarily plain language issues alone, but these are things that we could probably find someone who could talk about them. For example, some of our colleagues in 18F have a lot more civic tech design experience and language uh, experience with that specifically than we do, even if they don't necessarily call it plain language. Am I hitting any of the...
You are, and we're getting some
Okay.
good comments here about what potential future trainings could be. Can you just,
Hooray.
for plain language purposes, can you clarify 18F?
Um, for plain language purposes, well, let me see. They are a part of GSA's Technology Transformation Services Division, which means they go about digital services in I would say, a new way, with a particular focus on human-centered design, which you may have heard about through the OPM lab and some other things. And they are interested in definitely using new technologies. Now, anything apart from that, I'd probably have to quickly type in gsa.gov/18f or some 18f.gsa.gov, one of those. But I mean, simply because they have a wide range of what they're working on.
And then the next question here is, if we find some great examples of challenging languages, how should we share or talk about them, or would that be just too much?
Oh, no, not at all. I'd love to see them. My personal email is katherine.spivey@gsa.gov, or you can email it to me through plainlanguage.gov. I think it's info@plainlanguage.gov, and it goes to the team. We're always looking to add new examples. One of the things, let's see.
While you're pulling that up, I think the other thing I would recommend for people is what Adrian's chatting out here is there's a plain language community as well that can kind of
Oh,
do.
right. Yeah. Sorry. I'm going to plainlanguage.gov, and that's also where you can sign up for the community. I think we've got a couple thousand people interested in all aspects of plain language, but you can also see the guidelines, the law, different resources. And I was looking specifically at, this is what I find people really appreciate, is a lot of before and after. So, sometimes that's a really helpful thing to look at. Ambiguous wording rewritten. Yeah. Yeah, and some of this is agency rewrites. And some of it's using, usually using the guidance and just clarifying some things. So,
And then, do you see offering any train the trainer boot camps or
ah,
any other,
um,
like in terms of actual certifications that could be?
well, we can't offer certifications. We do have a train the trainer process, and let me explain why we're holding off. Let me first explain the requirements to become a trainer, which is you take a class, you take a plain language class from one of the trainers, and then the next thing is you take the boot camp. And then you observe another class, and then you co-teach, and then you teach and you're observed by a veteran trainer. And what has happened is we have a lot of people interested in becoming trainers, which is fantastic, and we love that. But what was happening is we were having the boot camps and we were hitting a huge bottleneck with the observing requirement, because sometimes, other agencies say, oh, you know, all the seats are filled with our own staff. We don't have space for an observer. That's in fact why I started doing these August classes, because we traditionally don't have a meeting in August. Usually we meet every other month besides August on a topic or a discussion, or we have a huddle or something. But August is, the dog days and nobody wants to do anything. So, I was holding classes so that people could come and observe and get that requirement out of the way. And I've co-taught to get a couple of people through the process, but we were just hitting these huge bottleneck. And we were like, we can't keep training people and having them get stuck. We have to do something about that. So we were hoping to get more people. In fact, if this had been an in-person class, I was reserving 4 spots for observers. But then COVID hit, and nobody's going anywhere.
And on a similar note regarding, uh, is there a list of specific requirements to become a trainer? And maybe can
I think that was what I just added. It's oh, and you have to get permission from your supervisor, and because you can't go ahead. And I mean, we actually had someone do this. They went through the process, and then they told their supervisor that we told them, the person, that they could teach plain language. And you still have to tell your boss. You still have to, some agencies make people put in for leave. You still have to clear that with your boss. You can't just, freelance like that. So, yeah, you have to get your permission from your supervisor, and you have to teach 2 classes for us in the DC metro area. We get a lot of requests from everywhere, quite frankly, and we're not doing classes right now because no one's traveling and no one's going into buildings. But and it's up to the trainer, so you have to sort of work it out. We get a request, we send it to the trainers, and somebody says got it, or not. Like I taught in February in Fort Belvoir because I was the closest, and I thought, oh, that's easy for me. I'll just pop down, do the 3-hour class, pop back. But it's, whether you can, a trainer can make it, and it depends on the schedule. We can't force any of our trainers to take a class. And we get questions. They're free classes if you're in the DC metro area. If you are not in the DC metro area, you have to pay for expenses. You have to pay for the trainer's airfare, mileage, per diem, hotel if that's necessary. Like we've had some people go out to the West Coast and stay for a week holding classes and boot camps and getting people through the process. But that was an intensive, that's all they did that week. And
we're getting a lot of
as I said,
questions too regarding,
sorry?
we're getting a lot of questions too regarding any possibility of changing these over to more virtual, or how we're going to kind of shift in the next year. to make all these things virtual?
We don't know. We really don't know how we're going to do this. I've been running, I mean, if I get a request from GSA, I do it virtually. I mean, I'll do like, you know, whatever training they want or reviewing, but I don't know. I mean, I'm just going to say that some agencies are better than others about moving virtually, moving online. Um, GSA has been teleworking since what, 2012? And so it was not that big a disruption, but I don't know how other agencies are going to be like it. And you know, it's going to depend on the trainers. I mean, some of the trainers may be better at and prefer in-person training. You know, and maybe not everyone's. I mean, this was a jump in the dark for us. You know, doing online training.
Um, I think we got a lot of good questions here. I think we have about 5 minutes left. Are there
Okay.
any other questions that people wanted to answered, or I think we got through all of them, but
Well, I'll take a look at the transcript afterward if you're since you're saving those.
yeah. So as Catherine mentioned, we'll host this video on digital.gov, and we'll be posting out to all the people registered, as well as people on the wait list once it's available. We'll also try to make some of these materials available as much as possible, and we are going to attempt to do this again in September with more information to come on that. But please join the plain language community on digital.gov or go to plainlanguage.gov for more information in the meantime. And we'll let you know when the next class is available. But thanks everybody for your time, and thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, Rhett, so much for your help, and I'm sorry for the video fiasco, but what's an online training without something not working? And I appreciate everyone coming. I really do.
Okay. Thanks everybody.